There's a hidden layer to how your mind works. Right beneath your conscious awareness, below the thoughts you think you're having, there's an entire operating system running decisions for you. You don't choose to use it. You were built with it. Long before you learned language, before you developed your sense of self, before you made your first deliberate choice, this system was already running. It's making decisions right now. While you're reading these words, while you're breathing, while you're existing in this moment, your brain is processing thousands of pieces of information and filtering them through patterns that were installed before you were even born. Most people believe they think clearly. They believe their thoughts are their own. They believe that when they make a decision, it's because they've considered the facts rationally and chosen wisely. But here's the truth that changes everything. Your mind doesn't work that way. Your brain is not a calculator that processes information objectively. It's a prediction machine that processes information to survive. It shortcuts, it fabricates, it deceives you constantly, not out of malice, but out of necessity. You were programmed to think in specific ways, not by other people, although they've certainly tried. You were programmed by evolution, by survival requirements, by the structure of human neurology itself. Your ancestors who thought clearly and rationally didn't survive as often as your ancestors who thought quickly and believed things that kept them alive. Your ancestors who questioned everything got killed by predators while they were still thinking. Your ancestors who saw patterns everywhere, even when those patterns weren't really there, lived to pass on their genes. This is why you have cognitive biases. Biases aren't flaws in human thinking. They're features. They're evidence that your mind is working exactly as it was designed to work. The problems that this design, this programming that kept humans alive for thousands of years, doesn't serve you well in the modern world. In fact, it actively works against you. You walk through life making thousands of decisions influenced by mental patterns you don't even recognize. You judge people based on their appearance within the first tenth of a second, and then you spend the rest of the interaction confirming that first impression, never considering that you were wrong. You remember events completely differently than they actually happened, and you're completely certain about your memory. You make choices based on what you saw yesterday, and then you convince yourself you made those choices based on logic. You believe things because people you trust believe them, and you filter out any information that contradicts those beliefs. The cognitive biases that shape your thinking are so fundamental to how your mind works that you can't see them. It's like asking a fish to explain water. The water is everywhere. It's the environment. Trying to see it would be like trying to see the air you breathe. But just because you can't see these biases doesn't mean they're not there. They're shaping your decisions, your relationships, your career, your life, right now, in this moment. What makes this fascinating is that knowing about these biases doesn't make you immune to them. In fact, knowing about them can sometimes make them worse. When you know that you're supposed to be rational, you become more confident in your irrational decisions. When you know that biases exist, you assume they happen to other people, not you. This is itself a bias. It's called the bias blind spot, and it's one of the most universal patterns in human psychology. The 25 cognitive biases you're about to explore are the operating system beneath your operating system. They explain why you think the way you think. They explain why you believe the things you believe. They explain why two people can look at the exact same information and come away with completely different conclusions. They explain why you're absolutely certain about things that are factually wrong. They explain why your mind has such a difficult time changing, even when presented with evidence that contradicts what you believe. Understanding these biases won't make you perfect. It won't make you rational. But it will make you aware. And awareness is the only thing that can create change. When you know how your mind works, when you understand the programming that runs beneath your consciousness, you get something precious, the possibility of choice. You get the possibility of noticing when your biases are about to influence a decision. You get the possibility of pausing before you act. You get the possibility of being slightly, just slightly more intentional about how you think. So as you explore these cognitive biases, don't approach them as interesting facts about human psychology. Approach them as a map of your own mind. Approach them as an owner's manual to your thinking. Every bias you encounter, every pattern you recognize is a place where your mind is already working. These aren't theoretical concepts. They're happening in your brain right now. Bias 1. The confirmation fuss. You see what you want to see. It's not that you're lying to yourself, though sometimes you are. It's that your brain literally filters information based on what you already believe. You believe something to be true, and then your mind becomes a filter for that belief. Evidence that supports your belief passes through easily. Evidence that contradicts your belief gets caught in the filter. You might notice it, but you notice it as an exception, as an outlier, as something that doesn't count for some reason. Here's how it works at the neurological level. Your brain is drowning in information. Every single moment, billions of pieces of data are hitting your senses. If your brain tried to process all of it equally, you would have what's called information overload. You would be paralyzed. You couldn't function. So your brain developed a solution. It prioritizes. It says, what information matters right now? And the answer to that question depends on what you already think matters. If you believe that your political party is right, then as you scroll through news, you'll see information that confirms your party is right. You'll read studies that support your position. You'll read criticisms of the opposing party. And your brain will go, perfect, this is relevant, this is important, remember this. But studies that show your party in a negative light, those will register as less important, less reliable, less relevant. A real-world example. A person believes that a particular brand of car is reliable. They buy that car. Now, everywhere they drive, they see that same car model on the road. They think, wow, this car must be popular because it's reliable. But the truth is that this car was always common on the road. What changed is their attention, not the frequency. This is confirmation bias. Your brain found evidence that confirms what you believe, and it became visible to you. Why does your brain work this way? Because belief is efficient. When you believe something, your brain doesn't have to process new information about that topic. It already has a conclusion. It can use its energy somewhere else. In a world of limited resources, limited attention, limited cognitive energy, this is brilliant. Your brain is trying to work as efficiently as possible. The problem is that efficiency is the enemy of accuracy. The more efficient your thinking becomes, the less accurate it might be. The hidden mechanism here is prediction. Your brain isn't trying to find truth, it's trying to predict what will happen next. If your prediction is based on the belief that something is true, then evidence that confirms that belief makes your predictions more confident, even if those predictions are wrong. Your brain would rather be confident and wrong than uncertain and right. The profound truth here is that your beliefs shape your reality more than reality shapes your beliefs. You are not a neutral observer of facts. You are an active participant in constructing your own version of truth, and that version of truth is filtered through beliefs you didn't even know you had. Bias 2. The anchoring bias. The first number you hear becomes the anchor for everything that comes after. It's not something you do consciously. It's automatic. Your brain grabs that first piece of information and uses it as a reference point. Everything else gets measured against it. Imagine you're in a store and you see a jacket that costs $500. Your brain registers that. Then you see the same jacket marked down to $250. Your brain doesn't evaluate whether $250 is a good price for that jacket in absolute terms. Instead, your brain compares it to the anchor, $500, and suddenly $250 feels like a bargain. You save $250. That's amazing. But if you had seen that jacket at $250 first with no anchor, you might have thought it was too expensive and walked away. The first number you encounter doesn't have to be logical. It doesn't have to make sense. It doesn't have to be relevant. It still becomes the anchor. Studies show that if you ask someone to estimate the percentage of African nations in the United Nations, and you first ask them to write down a random number, that random number affects their estimate. Their brain uses that random number as an anchor, even though it has nothing to do with the actual answer. Here's the sophisticated version of this bias. When you're negotiating a salary, the first number mentioned becomes the anchor. If the employer says $60,000 and you want to negotiate, the negotiation happens around $60,000. You might end up with $65,000 and you feel like you won because you got $5,000 more. But if you had anchored at $75,000 first, the negotiation would have happened around a completely different number. The final result might have been higher simply because the anchor was higher. This works in reverse too. If you see a price of $20 and then a price of $25 for the same item at two different stores, you remember that the item costs around $22, $23. You've anchored to the middle. When you see it for $30 later, it feels expensive. But if you had only seen prices of $30, you would think that was normal. Why does your brain do this? Because context is crucial for survival. If you see a predator, you don't want to evaluate whether predators are dangerous in an abstract sense. You need to know, is this predator more or less dangerous than other predators I've encountered? The first predator you saw becomes the anchor. That anchor tells you whether to fight, flee, or freeze. Anchoring allowed your ancestors to make quick survival decisions. The unconscious mechanism driving this is that your brain uses the anchor to constrain the range of possible answers. It says, the answer is probably somewhere around the anchor, give or take some percentage. It rarely ventures far from that first number. Even when you try consciously to adjust away from the anchor, you don't adjust far enough, you adjust slightly. The anchor holds. Bias 3. The availability heuristic. You believe that events which come to mind easily happen more frequently than they actually do. If you can think of examples of something quickly, your brain assumes that thing is common. If you can't think of examples, your brain assumes it's rare. A person watches a news program that spends 2 hours discussing plane crashes. The next day, that person is nervous about flying. They think about plane crashes. They think plane crashes must be happening all the time. But statistically, you're far more likely to die in a car accident than a plane crash. The plane crash is available to their mind because it was recently featured prominently. A car accident is less available because it's not as talked about, not as emotionally powerful, not as memorable. Here's a darker example. If you've witnessed violence, you believe the world is more violent than it actually is. If someone you know has had a serious health condition, you believe that health condition is more common than statistics suggest. Your mind makes these beliefs feel true because the examples are vivid. The memory is available. You can visualize it. You can remember how you felt about it. The availability heuristic is particularly powerful when combined with emotion. If something is emotionally intense, it's more available. If something is recent, it's more available. If something is personally relevant, it's more available. Your brain essentially says, If I can think about this easily and it feels important, then it must be important. In the workplace, this bias affects how you evaluate people. If a colleague made a mistake that was highly visible and emotionally charged if they failed in front of the boss, for example, you will overestimate how often they make mistakes. That mistake is available to your mind, but their hundreds of successful projects are not available because they're not as memorable, not as emotionally charged. So when you evaluate this person's overall performance, you weight that one available mistake far too heavily. Why does your brain work this way? Because in a natural environment, the things that happen frequently are usually visible, memorable, and easy to think about. If something is easy to bring to mind, it's usually because your brain has encountered it many times. So using availability as a heuristic, a mental shortcut, usually gives you accurate information. The problem is that in modern life, things that are easily available to your mind are not necessarily things that happen most frequently. They're often things that are just memorable. The mechanism beneath this is memory accessibility. Your brain doesn't keep track of frequencies in any abstract sense. It doesn't have a database of statistics. Instead, it uses the ease with which you can retrieve examples as a proxy for frequency. If retrieval is easy, frequency must be high. This is usually a good shortcut, but it fails in a world where media, entertainment, and social media can make rare things seem common and common things seem invisible. Bias 4. The representativeness heuristic. You judge the likelihood of something based on how similar it is to your mental image of that category, not based on actual statistical probabilities. If something looks like what you think something should look like, you assume it's that thing. Here's a classic example. A person is described as quiet, organized, thoughtful, and interested in numbers. Most people assume this person is an accountant, but accountants are maybe 1% of the population. Most quiet, organized, thoughtful people interested in numbers are not accountants. They're nurses, teachers, scientists, librarians, or have any number of other jobs. But because the description matches the mental image of an accountant, people assume that's what this person is. In dating and relationships, the representativeness heuristic is incredibly powerful. You have a mental image of what your ideal partner looks like, what they should be like, how they should behave. Then you meet someone who matches that image. Suddenly you think, this is my person, this is the one. But that mental image might be based on old movies, on what you saw growing up, on patterns that aren't actually predictive of a good relationship. You're matching them to a prototype instead of evaluating them as an individual. Here's the sophisticated version. You have a mental image of what a CEO looks like, usually tall, confident, charismatic. If someone is tall and confident and charismatic, you might think they have leadership potential. But the representativeness heuristic tells you nothing about whether they can actually lead. Maybe they're confident about things they shouldn't be confident about. Maybe their charisma masks poor decision-making. The prototype doesn't predict the actual ability. Why does your brain do this? Because categorization is survival critical. If you see something that looks like a predator, you need to treat it like a predator immediately. You don't have time to do a statistical analysis of the probability that this thing is actually a predator based on base rates in the population. You need to use similarity to known categories. If it looks like a threat, you treat it like a threat. Representativeness allowed your ancestors to survive. The hidden mechanism is category matching. Your brain is constantly comparing what it perceives to internal categories. If there's a match, it activates the response associated with that category. This is efficient. but it often ignores base rates, the actual statistical frequency of things in the world. Your brain cares about similarity, not statistics. Bias 5. The sunk cost fallacy. You continue doing something because you've already invested time, money, or effort into it, even when continuing makes no rational sense. The past investment becomes the justification for future investment. A person has been working at a job they hate for 5 years. They don't quit because they think about those 5 years. They think, I've already spent 5 years here. If I leave now, those 5 years will have been wasted. But this reasoning is backwards. Those 5 years have already passed. They are gone. Whether you spend the next 5 years at this job or not has nothing to do with whether the previous 5 years were wasted. The time is gone. The only thing that matters is, will the next year be better here or somewhere else? But your mind doesn't think that way. Your mind uses past investment as a justification for future investment because it feels like commitment. It feels like consistency. If you've already invested this much, quitting would mean admitting that the investment was wrong, and admitting you were. Wrong feels worse than continuing to be wrong. Here's an example with relationships. A person has been in a relationship for 7 years. The relationship isn't working anymore. But they stay because they think about those 7 years. They think, I've already invested so much time, I can't leave now. Again, the logic is backwards. The 7 years are gone. Whether the relationship ends now or continues for another 2 unhappy years doesn't change the fact that the first 7 years happened. The only question that matters is, will staying make the next year better or worse? In businesses, the sunk cost fallacy leads to catastrophic decisions. A company invests millions in a project. Halfway through, they realize the project won't work. But they continue investing because they've already spent so much money. They can't stop because that would mean admitting the money was wasted. So they throw good money after bad money, hoping that eventually the project will pay off when the rational thing to do is cut losses and move on. The mechanism driving this is identity and consistency. Your brain wants to see you as someone who makes good decisions. If you invested in something and now you realize it was wrong, your brain sees this as a threat to your identity. So instead of accepting that you made a wrong decision, your brain justifies continuing the investment. It tells you that this is the right move, even though it isn't. Why does your brain do this? Because in a social species, consistency is important. If you keep changing your mind, if you keep abandoning things you've invested in, other people lose trust in you. So your brain has developed a strong drive toward consistency, even when that consistency is irrational, even when consistency costs you. Bias 6. The Dunning-Kruger effect. The less you know about something, the more confident you are that you know about it. As you gain actual knowledge, your confidence drops. The most knowledgeable people are often the least confident. A person with minimal knowledge of medicine watches a few health videos on the internet. Suddenly, they're convinced they're almost a doctor. They'll give health advice to their friends. They'll question their actual doctor's recommendations. They're supremely confident in their incomplete knowledge. But someone who has spent 10 years studying medicine spends their days aware of how much they don't know. They know about all the edge cases, all the things that can go wrong, all the exceptions to the rules. Their confidence is lower despite their knowledge being vastly superior. This bias explains why arguments on the internet are so confident. The least informed people are the most certain about their positions. They don't know what they don't know, so their confidence soars. They've got maybe one piece of information or one perspective, and from that limited vantage point, they're absolutely sure they're right. In the workplace, this is devastating. Someone is promoted to a position where they have some expertise. They become confident, maybe even arrogant. Then they move to a new position where they know far less. Suddenly they're less confident, but they're also worse at the job because they actually know less. This creates situations where less competent people are more confident, leading them to make bolder, worse decisions. Here's the neural mechanism. Confidence is generated by familiarity. When you've been exposed to information recently, when you've thought about a topic, when you can recall examples easily, your brain generates a feeling of confidence. But that feeling of confidence is based on access to knowledge, not on the actual completeness of your knowledge. You might have access to one dimension of a topic and feel confident, not realizing that there are a dozen dimensions you're completely unaware of. Why does your brain work this way? Because confidence is sometimes adaptive. Overconfident people take action. Uncertain people hesitate. If an environment rewards action, then overconfidence serves a purpose. The problem is that overconfidence is most dangerous when it leads to inaction from other people. If the overconfident person is giving you advice, and you assume they know more than they do because they're so confident, you might make bad decisions based on their false certainty. Bias 7. The backfire effect. When you're presented with information that contradicts what you believe, you don't just reject it, you actually believe your original position more strongly. Your brain defends your beliefs against contradiction, sometimes by making those beliefs stronger. A person believes in a conspiracy theory. You show them evidence that the conspiracy theory is false. The evidence is clear. It's from reliable sources. But instead of reconsidering their belief, this person becomes more convinced that the conspiracy is real. They think, why would they show me this false evidence unless they're trying to cover up what's really happening? The contradiction strengthens the belief instead of weakening it. This happens because your brain treats your beliefs like part of your identity. When you attack a belief, your brain feels attacked. It feels like someone is threatening your sense of self, your sense of reality, your sense of understanding the world. So your brain fights back. It doesn't calmly reconsider. It defends. It gets stronger. It digs deeper. Here's an example with politics. Research shows that when people from opposing political parties are given factual information that contradicts their party's position, those people often become more convinced of their party's position, not less. The facts backfire. The evidence makes the belief stronger. In personal relationships, the backfire effect is particularly destructive. You and your partner disagree about something. You present evidence that you're right, but instead of reconsidering, your partner becomes more convinced they're right. Now, you're not just disagreeing about facts, you're in an escalating cycle where contradictions make beliefs stronger. The mechanism driving this is cognitive consistency. Your brain is motivated to maintain a coherent self-image and a coherent view of the world. When something contradicts that coherence, your brain experiences cognitive dissonance, an uncomfortable feeling of internal conflict. To resolve that discomfort, your brain doesn't necessarily change its beliefs. Often, it strengthens them. It looks for reasons why the contradicting evidence is wrong. It finds people who agree with you and focuses on their perspective. It creates a stronger narrative that incorporates the contradiction as evidence of conspiracy or manipulation. Why does your brain do this? Because abandoning a belief that's become part of your identity is hard. It feels like dying a little bit. If you've built your sense of self around certain beliefs, changing those beliefs means changing who you are. That's threatening. So your brain protects itself by making beliefs stronger when they're attacked. Bias 8. The false consensus effect. You believe that more people agree with you than actually do. You believe that your way of thinking, your values, your behaviors are more common and more normal than they really are. A person has a particular political view. They believe this view is held by most people. But surveys show that only a minority holds this view. Why does this person believe most people agree with them? Because the people they spend time with agree with them. Their social circles, their family, their friends, the media they consume, all of it is filtered to show them people who think like they do. So from their perspective, it looks like most people think this way. This creates polarization. Each side of a political divide believes they're the normal ones, and the other side is the crazy minority. Both sides are wrong. Both sides are overestimating their own consensus. Both sides are underestimating the diversity of opinion in the broader population. Here's a subtler example. A person enjoys going to museums on weekends. They assume most people in their social class enjoy museums. But surveys show that most people don't go to museums very often. This person's belief in false consensus makes them think their interests are more mainstream than they are. In business, the false consensus effect causes problems. A manager thinks their vision for the company is shared by most employees, but surveys show that most employees don't even know about the vision, let alone agree with it. The manager assumes consensus that doesn't exist, so they make decisions without adequately explaining or justifying them. The mechanism driving this is selective attention and social filtering. Your brain encounters thousands of perspectives. It filters them through your existing beliefs, your social circles, your media consumption. The perspectives that pass through the filter are the ones that agree with you or that you encounter most frequently. So your brain builds a model of the world based on filtered data. From that filtered perspective, your views look like the consensus. Why does your brain work this way? Because understanding consensus is important for social species. You need to know what the group believes so you can either fit in or deliberately stand apart. But because your brain filters information, your model of the group consensus is distorted. It reflects your social position, not the actual population. Bias 9. The curse of knowledge. Once you know something, you can't imagine not knowing it. You assume that other people know what you know or should be able to figure it out easily. This makes you impatient with people who don't understand, and it makes you a bad teacher and communicator. A person has worked in an industry for 5 years. They know all the jargon, all the processes, all the background information. Then they try to explain something in their field to someone who doesn't work in that field. The expert gets frustrated. They say, "It's so simple. I don't understand why you don't get it." But it's not simple to the person hearing it for the first time. They don't have the background knowledge. They don't know the jargon. But the expert can't imagine not knowing these things, so they can't effectively teach. This bias makes it hard to write clear instructions. The person writing the instructions knows how to do the task, so they skip steps they assume are obvious. But to someone doing the task for the first time, those steps aren't obvious at all. The instruction gets confusing. Here's an example with parenting. Parents who learn to read early sometimes can't understand why their children struggle with reading. The parents know how to read. It feels natural. They can't imagine not being able to read. So they get impatient with their children or assume the children aren't trying hard enough. They don't account for the fact that reading is an incredibly complex skill that their child hasn't yet mastered. In presentations, the curse of knowledge is devastating. An expert presents to an audience. The expert has been thinking about the topic for months or years. All the complex ideas have been synthesized and automated in their mind. So they explain things quickly, skip important background information, and lose the audience. They can't imagine not understanding what seems obvious to them. The mechanism driving this is knowledge inaccessibility. Once something becomes automatic in your brain, you lose access to the step-by-step process of how you know it. You just know it. You can't reconstruct the learning process because it's been automated. So when someone else is going through that learning process, you can't see it. You can't understand why it's difficult. Why does your brain automate knowledge like this? Because automation is efficient. If you had to consciously think through every step of every task you know how to do, you would have no mental energy left for anything else. So your brain automates knowledge, but this automation makes it hard to remember what it was like not to know. Bias 10. The recency. Bias. You weight recent events more heavily than older events when making judgments. What happened recently feels more important, more relevant, more true than what happened long ago. A student performs poorly on an exam. The few weeks before the exam, they didn't study much. The previous 9 weeks of the class, they studied consistently and performed well. But when the teacher evaluates this student's overall performance, the recent poor performance dominates. The teacher thinks this student isn't very good at this subject. Even though the student's actual track record is quite good, the recent event overrides the historical data. In stock trading, this bias causes problems. A stock goes up for a few days. Suddenly people think it's going to keep going up. The recent trend feels like a reliable indicator of the future. But the stock market has been going up for 5 years before this week's dip. People forget about the 5-year context and focus on the recent trend. In relationships, recency bias means that recent arguments or recent hurt feelings tend to dominate how you feel about the relationship, even if the recent problems are a new development. A couple has been together for 10 years and had a great relationship. Then they have some issues for 3 weeks. Suddenly, the person might think, maybe this relationship isn't working, because the recent problems feel more salient than 10 years of good times. Here's a more insidious example. A friend has been generally reliable and kind for years, but recently they've been distant and unresponsive. Your judgment of your friend becomes dominated by this recent behavior. You start questioning their character, not realizing that something temporary is changing your overall assessment. The mechanism driving this is salience. Recent events are more salient in your mind. They're fresher. They're easier to recall. So when you make a judgment, you weight the information that comes to mind most easily. Recency makes information more available, so recent information dominates your judgments. Why does your brain do this? In a changing environment, recent information is usually more predictive than old information. If you're tracking the weather, yesterday's weather is more predictive than the weather from a month ago. If you're tracking someone's behavior, their recent behavior is more predictive than their behavior from years ago. Usually, but not always. Sometimes patterns that have been true for years are more important than recent anomalies. Bias 11. The outcome. Bias: you judge the quality of a decision by its outcome, not by whether the decision was rational given the information available when it was made. Good outcomes make bad decisions seem smart. Bad outcomes make good decisions seem foolish. A person makes an investment. At the time of the decision, all the available data suggested it was a reasonable investment. But the investment goes bad anyway. Everyone says that was a stupid investment. But the decision wasn't stupid given the information available. It just had a bad outcome. In sports, outcome bias is rampant. A coach makes a call during a game. If it works out, people say the coach is brilliant. If it fails, people say the coach is an idiot. But the quality of the call shouldn't depend on outcome. A. risky call that happens to work out is not necessarily a good call. A conservative call that happens to fail is not necessarily a bad call. Here's a dangerous example with medicine. A doctor has a patient with symptoms. The doctor makes a decision about what to do based on the patient's presentation and medical knowledge. If the patient recovers, the doctor's decision seems smart, even if another approach might have worked better. If the patient gets worse, the decision seems wrong, even if it was the best decision given the available information at the time. In business, outcome bias leads to terrible decision-making processes. A company takes a risk. If the risk pays off, the company's risk-taking is celebrated. People think the company has good judgment. But the company might just have been lucky. If they take the same risk again with the same reasoning, they might not be lucky the second time. But the positive outcome from the first risk has biased how people evaluate the company's decision-making. The mechanism driving this is narrative construction. Your brain looks at an outcome and works backward to construct a narrative that explains why that outcome happened. If the outcome is good, the narrative is positive. If the outcome is bad, the narrative is negative. But the narrative your brain constructs after the outcome is known is different from the narrative that would exist if you were evaluating the decision before the outcome occurred. Why does your brain work this way? Because learning from experience is important. You need to update your understanding based on results. But your brain doesn't distinguish between good outcomes that came from good decisions versus good outcomes that came from luck. So, it learns wrong lessons. Bias 12. The fundamental attribution error. You attribute other people's behavior to their internal characteristics, their personality, their intelligence, their values, while attributing your own behavior to external circumstances. You judge others by who they are. You judge yourself by what happened to you. A person is late to a meeting. If someone else is late, you think they're an irresponsible person. If you're late, you think there was traffic. The other person's behavior is explained by their character. Your behavior is explained by circumstances. A person cuts you off in traffic. You think they're a reckless driver. If you cut someone off, you think, I didn't see them. Again, other people's behavior is explained by their character. Your behavior is explained by circumstances. In the workplace, this bias creates conflicts. A colleague makes a mistake. You think, they're not competent. But when you make a mistake, you think, I was overworked. The fundamental attribution error keeps you from seeing that your colleague was probably overworked too. Here's a subtler version. You observe someone being mean to another person. You think, that person is cruel. You're attributing their behavior to their internal cruelty. But you don't see what happened before you arrived. You don't see the context. The person might have been reacting to something, responding to being treated poorly. But from your limited perspective, you see meanness and attribute it to a mean character. The mechanism driving this is perspective and information access. When you observe someone else's behavior, you see the behavior but not the internal thoughts, feelings, and constraints. So you attribute the behavior to character. When you perform the same behavior, you have full access to your thoughts, feelings, and constraints. You know you're stressed. You know you didn't see the car. You know you had a reason. So you attribute your behavior to circumstances. Why does your brain do this? Because it's efficient to have a stable model of who people are. If you attributed everyone's behavior entirely to circumstances, you'd have to recalculate your understanding of each person constantly. Instead, you create stable personality models. When you see evidence consistent with those models, you use that evidence to solidify the model. When you see evidence inconsistent with those models, you attribute it to circumstances and leave the model intact. Bias 13. The illusion of control. You believe you have more control over outcomes than you actually do, especially over outcomes that are partially random or determined by forces outside your influence. A person plays a lottery. They believe they have a strategy for picking winning numbers, even though lottery numbers are completely random and all numbers have equal probability of winning. But the person feels like they have some control. Maybe they pick their lucky numbers. Maybe they avoid numbers that came up recently. This gives them a feeling of control, even though their strategy has zero actual effect on the outcome. In gambling, the illusion of control is devastating. A person rolls dice and feels like they can control the outcome. Maybe they throw the dice in a particular way or imagine a particular result. This gives them a false sense of control that keeps them gambling, even when the odds are clearly against them. Here's a professional example. A salesperson thinks they have control over whether they make a sale. Some aspects of the sale are within their control: how they present, how well they listen, how they address concerns. But many aspects are outside their control: the customer's budget, the customer's previous experiences with similar products, market conditions. The salesperson might believe they have more control than they do, leading them to take too much credit for successes and not enough responsibility for failures. In investing, the illusion of control is common. An investor believes that their stock picks are based on superior analysis and that they have control over investment outcomes. But many factors are outside their control: market sentiment, economic conditions, geopolitical events. The investor might believe they have more control than they do, leading them to be overconfident. The mechanism driving this is agency and causation. Your brain is built to identify causes and effects. When you take action and something happens, your brain naturally connects those two events. So when you roll dice and get a 6, your brain might connect your throwing action to the outcome, even though the outcome was determined by physical laws that have nothing to do with your intention. Why does your brain work this way? Because in many situations, taking action and believing you have control is adaptive. If you believe you can improve your health through exercise and diet, you'll exercise and eat better, and you'll actually be healthier. The belief in control creates outcomes, but this works only when you actually have control. When you have no control, the illusion leads to poor decisions. Bias 14. The halo effect. If someone is beautiful, intelligent, or successful, you assume they're good in other unrelated areas too. One positive quality creates an overall positive impression that colors how you perceive everything else about them. An attractive person is assumed to be more intelligent, more moral, more trustworthy than they actually are. Companies spend millions on advertising because they know that attractive actors sell products, even though there's no logical connection between the actor's appearance and the quality of the product. But your brain creates that connection automatically. A person is successful in one field. You assume they're intelligent and competent across all fields, even fields where they have no expertise. A billionaire is assumed to be wise about all topics, even topics that have nothing to do with making money. A celebrity is assumed to have good taste in politics, even though fame and political acumen are unrelated. Here's a subtler example. A friend is kind to you. You assume they're kind to everyone. A boss is competent at their job. You assume they're competent at everything, including parenting, relationships, health. One positive quality halos over into other areas where you don't actually have information. In the criminal justice system, the halo effect is devastating. A defendant who is attractive and well-spoken is assumed to be less guilty than a defendant who is unattractive or has poor communication skills, even when the evidence is identical. The overall impression created by appearance and presentation halos over into judgments about the case itself. The mechanism driving this is unified perception. Your brain doesn't perceive people as collections of independent traits. It perceives people as unified wholes. When you see multiple positive traits, your brain wants to create a coherent overall impression. So it assumes other positive traits must also be present, even when it has no information about those traits. Why does your brain work this way? Because in a stable social environment with small groups, people who are good in one area are often good in other areas too. The king who is successful at warfare often has other positive qualities. The beautiful woman in a small village usually comes from a good family with good values, so assuming halo effects used to be somewhat predictive. But in modern life, with mass society, celebrity, and media, halo effects lead us astray. Bias 15. The just world hypothesis. You believe that the world is fundamentally fair and just, that bad things happen to bad people and good things happen to good people. This belief causes you to blame victims for their misfortunes and to believe that inequalities are deserved. A person hears about someone who is poor. They assume the person must be lazy or unintelligent. They think, if they worked hard, they'd be successful like me. They don't account for inequality of opportunity, systemic barriers, luck, or circumstances. The belief in a just world compels them to assume that poor people deserve to be poor. A person hears about someone who got cancer. They assume the person must have done something unhealthy. They think, I'm healthy because I exercise and eat well. They don't account for the fact that cancer is often random, genetic, or environmental. The belief in a just world compels them to assume that cancer must be a consequence of the person's behavior. Here's a more subtle version. A person is in an abusive relationship. Their friends think they must be doing something to provoke the abuse. The friends believe in a just world where abuse doesn't happen to innocent people. So they assume the victim must be partly responsible. This is a devastating misapplication of the just world hypothesis. In business, the just world hypothesis leads to lack of sympathy for employees who struggle. A CEO thinks, if you're not succeeding, it's because you're not trying hard enough. They don't account for differences in education, family support, health, or other factors that affect success. The mechanism driving this is predictability and meaning-making. A world that is just is predictable. You can understand why things happen, but a world that is unjust is chaotic and terrifying. You could do everything right and still suffer. So your brain prefers to believe in a just world because that's less frightening. If bad things happen to bad people, then as long as you're good, you'll be safe. Why does your brain do this? Because meaning-making is psychologically important. Randomness is terrifying. If things happen randomly, then your planning and efforts might be for nothing. So your brain seeks patterns that make the world predictable and just. The belief in a just world is psychologically comforting, even though it's often false. Bias 16. The declinism. Bias, you believe that the past was better than the present and that things are getting worse. You romanticize the past and discount the present and future. A person remembers their childhood as perfect, endless days of play, simplicity, innocence. They compare that memory to their adult life with responsibilities and stressors, and they think, things were so much better then. But their memory of childhood is filtered through nostalgia. They forget about childhood fears, boredom, and lack of agency. They've built a false narrative about the past. In politics, declinism is powerful. A person believes the country was better 50 years ago. They point to specific problems today: crime, unemployment, family breakdown, without realizing that these problems often existed in the past too, sometimes to a greater degree. By almost every objective measure, most countries are better now than they were 50 years ago. People live longer. Fewer die from disease. Poverty is lower. But the feeling of declinism persists. Here's a professional example. A manager thinks the company was better 5 years ago. They blame recent hires for the company's problems. They think people used to be more committed, people used to work harder. But the company has changed. Markets have changed. The manager's expectations might have changed, but the belief in decline feels true. In media, declinism is rampant. News focuses on problems and failures more than successes. You hear about conflicts, crimes, and disasters. You don't hear about all the disasters that didn't happen, all the people who recovered from illness, all the conflicts that were resolved peacefully. So your sense of current events is biased toward negativity. The mechanism driving this is selective memory and contrast. You remember the past incompletely. Your brain selectively stores memories that are either emotionally significant or that support a narrative you believe. So your memory of the past is distorted. Additionally, you compare a vivid present, all the details you're currently experiencing, to a simplified, idealized version of the past. The present always comes up short in that comparison. Why does your brain do this? Because there's evolutionary value to maintaining high standards. If you're satisfied with the present, you might not strive to improve. If you believe things are declining, you might be motivated to fight harder. So your brain might maintain a declinism bias, partly as a motivational tool. But this bias costs you happiness and leads to political movements that are based on false narratives about the past. Bias 17. The false memory effect. Your memories are not recordings of what actually happened. Your memories are reconstructions that change over time and that are highly influenced by suggestions, imagination, and what you want to believe. A person remembers a childhood event. They tell the story many times. Each time they tell it, they add details. Maybe a friend suggests a detail. "Wasn't there a dog?" the friend asks. Now the person remembers a dog, even if there was no dog. The memory has been rewritten. In legal proceedings, eyewitness testimony is often unreliable because memories are reconstructed, not replayed. A witness sees a crime. They're asked detailed questions about what they saw. The questions themselves can suggest details. Was the car red? If the witness is uncertain and the questioner is confident, the witness might now remember a red car. When the witness testifies in court months later, they genuinely remember a red car, not realizing that their memory was constructed and modified over time. Here's a personal example. You remember an argument you had with someone. Your memory of what was said, who said what first, and what you were trying to communicate is probably somewhat different from how the other person remembers it. You've both reconstructed the memory to be consistent with your perspectives and your narratives about the relationship. Researchers have shown that through guided imagination and suggestion, they can create false memories, memories of events that never happened. People can be convinced they were lost in the mall as a child, and they'll remember it, even though it never happened. Their brain constructs a memory to fit the suggestion. The mechanism driving this is reconstruction and narrative integration. Your brain doesn't store memories as files. It stores elements and patterns. When you recall a memory, your brain reconstructs it using those elements and patterns, plus your current understanding of the world. If your current understanding changes, your memory can change too. Why does your brain work this way? Because storage space is limited. Instead of storing complete recordings of events, your brain stores key information and relies on reconstruction. This is efficient for storage, but terrible for accuracy. Your brain is willing to sacrifice accuracy for efficiency. Bias 18. The primacy bias. The first information you receive about something is disproportionately influential. First impressions dominate how you perceive people and situations, even when later information contradicts those impressions. A teacher meets a student. The student seems shy and withdrawn on the first day of class. The teacher forms an impression. This is a quiet student. Later in the year, as the student becomes more comfortable and participates more in class, the teacher still remembers the first impression. The teacher might still think of the student as quiet, even though the student's behavior has changed. The first impression persists, even though it's no longer accurate. In job interviews, the primacy bias is powerful. An interviewer makes a decision about a candidate in the first few minutes. The candidate's appearance, initial comments, and first handshake create a lasting impression. Later interview responses are filtered through that initial impression. If the first impression is positive, negative information is discounted. If the first impression is negative, positive information is discounted. In relationships, the first date creates an impression that's hard to overcome. If the first date goes well, you're primed to see subsequent dates in a positive light. You'll interpret ambiguous behavior as positive. If the first date goes poorly, you'll interpret subsequent behavior in a negative light. Here's a political example. The first campaign at a voter season and election season creates an impression that influences how they perceive all subsequent information about that candidate. If the first ad is negative, the voter approaches the candidate negatively. If the first ad is positive, the voter approaches the candidate positively. Later information is filtered through that initial frame. The mechanism driving this is encoding and anchoring. Information that comes first is encoded more deeply because you have fewer competing representations. It becomes the reference point. Later information is interpreted relative to that reference point. If later information contradicts the first impression, your brain might revise the first impression, but the revision is usually partial. The first information usually maintains disproportionate influence. Why does your brain work this way? Because efficiency requires prioritizing early information. If you had to consider all information equally, you'd be paralyzed. By making quick judgments based on first information and then refining those judgments, you can make reasonably good decisions quickly. But this bias means you're probably wrong about more people and situations than you realize. Bias 19. The planning fallacy. You systematically underestimate how long tasks will take, how much they'll cost, and how difficult they'll be. You make optimistic predictions about your own future, even though your predictions about others are more realistic. A person plans to renovate their house. They think it will take 1 month. They've seen renovations on TV that are completed in an hour. But when they start, they realize it's much more complicated. There are hidden problems. Suppliers are delayed. It takes 4 months. They could have looked at statistics showing that home renovations take much longer than planned. They could have asked people who've renovated homes, but they believed their own optimistic prediction. In software development, the planning fallacy is legendary. Projects consistently take longer than predicted, but developers keep predicting that the next project will be on time. They don't adequately account for debugging, testing, unforeseen complications, and integration problems. Here's a personal example. You plan to write a report. You think it will take 3 hours, but when you start, you realize you need to gather data, Clarify your thinking, write multiple drafts, get feedback, and revise. It takes 10 hours, but the next time you plan to write a report, you think it will take 3 hours again. In business, the planning fallacy leads to projects that are behind schedule and over budget. Managers make plans based on optimistic timelines. When those timelines fail, they don't adjust their planning process. They remain optimistic about the next project. The mechanism driving this is inside view versus outside view. When you're planning your own project, you focus on the specific details of that project, inside view. You think about what you'll do, what's unique about this project. You don't adequately consider base rates, how long similar projects usually take, outside view. If you consider the outside view, the statistics of how long similar projects take, your predictions would be more accurate, but your brain emphasizes the inside view. Why does your brain do this? Because you have detailed information about your own plan and limited information about others' plans. So the inside view feels more trustworthy. But the inside view is usually over-optimistic because people underestimate problems they haven't encountered yet. Bias 20, the bystander effect. When you're in a group, you're less likely to help in an emergency compared to when you're alone. The presence of other people makes you feel less responsible for taking action. A person has a heart attack on a crowded street. 50 people see it. How many call for help? Often fewer than if one person had witnessed the same event. When 50 people are present, each person thinks someone else will help. Each person feels less personal responsibility. So no one helps, and the person dies. In the office, when a group of people receive an email asking for volunteers for a project, fewer people volunteer than if each person received an individual request. In a group, people feel less responsible. They think someone else will volunteer. Here's a subtler version. A child is being treated poorly by a parent in public. When one person is present, that person is more likely to intervene. When multiple people are present, each person feels less personally responsible. They think someone else will intervene. So the child continues to be treated poorly. In online contexts, the bystander effect is powerful. When a person is being attacked or harassed online and thousands of people see it, often very few people respond or defend the person. Each person feels less responsible because there are so many others who could respond. The mechanism driving this is responsibility diffusion and audience inhibition. When you're alone, responsibility is clear. You're the only one who can help. But when others are present, responsibility is diffused. You're one of many who could help. Your brain interprets this as lowered personal responsibility. Additionally, when you're in a group, you feel watched. You worry about how your action will be judged. This creates audience inhibition, hesitation to act because of the presence of observers. Why does your brain do this? Because in groups, the group itself is supposed to provide social monitoring and collective action. Your brain assumes that if something is really wrong, someone in the group will address it, so you don't feel like you have to. But this assumption is wrong when everyone in the group is making the same assumption. Bias 21. The spotlight effect. You believe that other people are paying more attention to you than they actually are. You feel like you're in the spotlight constantly, and you assume that other people notice your flaws, your mistakes, your embarrassing moments as much as you do. A person has an embarrassing moment, they stumble, they say something stupid in a meeting, they have a stain on their shirt. They think everyone noticed. They think people will remember this embarrassing moment forever. But studies show that most people didn't even notice. And even if they did notice, they forgot about it within minutes. People are too focused on their own concerns to pay much attention to your minor flaws. This bias creates unnecessary anxiety. You worry about how you look or how you came across. You assume everyone is judging you. But most people are too focused on themselves to judge you. Most people are worried about how they look and how they came across. In presentations, the spotlight effect creates anxiety. You think the audience is scrutinizing your every word, judging your appearance, noticing your nervousness. But the audience is mostly just trying to understand your content. They're not analyzing you the way you're analyzing yourself. Here's a professional example. You make a mistake at work. You assume your boss noticed and is judging you, but your boss probably didn't notice. And even if they did notice, they're too focused on their own problems to dwell on your mistake. The mechanism driving this is egocentrism and salience. Everything you do feels salient and important to you because you're the center of your own universe. Your mistakes feel huge. Your flaws feel obvious, so you assume they're obvious to everyone else too. But other people are the center of their own universes. They're focused on themselves, not on you. Why does your brain do this? Because you have unique access to your own internal states. You know how nervous you are. You know about your flaws. So those things feel obvious, but other people don't have that access. They only see your external behavior, and they interpret it through their own filters and concerns, not through detailed scrutiny of you. Bias 22. The third person effect. You believe that other people are more influenced by media, advertising, and propaganda than you are. You think you see through it, but other people fall for it. A person watches a political advertisement. They think it's manipulative, but they assume that other people will be influenced by it more than they will. They see through it, but others won't. The person's evaluation of their own media literacy is higher than their evaluation of others' media literacy. This bias extends to all forms of persuasion. People think they're resistant to advertising, but that other people are vulnerable. People think they're immune to propaganda, but that other people will believe it. People think they're skeptical of conspiracy theories, but that other people will fall for them. In the workplace, the third-person effect causes problems. A manager sends out a communication to employees. The manager thinks, "I'll understand this correctly," but some employees might misunderstand it. So the manager creates instructions that are unclear because they believe they'll understand the unclear parts but assumes others won't. But actually, everyone struggles with the unclear instructions. In social media, the third-person effect is powerful. People share posts thinking, "I understand this is a joke, but other people might think it's serious." Or, "I understand this is sarcasm, but other people might take it literally." So people inadvertently spread misinformation because they believe they're immune, but that others aren't. The mechanism driving this is media immunity and self-perception. You have access to the thoughts and reasoning processes in your own head. You know why you believe what you believe. You can articulate your skepticism and critical thinking. But you don't have access to other people's internal thoughts, so you assume they're less sophisticated, less critical, less immune to influence than you are. This is usually false, but the bias makes it feel true. Why does your brain do this? Because self-enhancement is psychologically rewarding. It feels good to believe you're more intelligent, more critical, more resistant to manipulation than average. So your brain maintains this belief, even though it's often wrong. Bias 23. The illusion of transparency. You believe that other people can see inside your mind, that your thoughts and feelings are more obvious to them than they actually are. And conversely, you believe you can see inside other people's minds more clearly than you actually can. A person is anxious about a presentation. They feel like everyone can see their anxiety. But when they give the presentation, people tell them they seemed confident. The person's internal anxiety was invisible to the audience, but the person believed it was obvious. This bias creates misunderstandings in relationships. You're upset with your partner, but you haven't told them you're upset. You think they should know you're upset. You think it's obvious, but it's not obvious. Your partner can't see inside your head, so they're confused about why you're distant or short with them. You think they're ignoring your feelings, but they don't even realize you have hurt feelings. Here's a professional example. You're frustrated with a colleague's performance. You think it's obvious that you're frustrated, but the colleague doesn't realize you're frustrated. They think everything is fine between you. When you finally say something, the colleague is shocked. They had no idea you felt this way. Conversely, you assume you can see other people's feelings clearly. You observe someone and think you know what they're thinking. But you're probably wrong. You have limited information. You can see their facial expressions and hear their words, but you can't see their internal thoughts. You fill in the gaps with assumptions. The mechanism driving this is access asymmetry and egocentric perspective. You have full access to your own thoughts and feelings. They feel obvious and clear. So you assume they're obvious to everyone. But other people only see your external behavior. You have limited access to other people's internal thoughts. So you fill in the gaps based on your own assumptions. But these gaps contain huge amounts of information you're not actually aware of. Why does your brain do this? Because your perspective is the only one you have direct access to. So it feels like the most complete and accurate perspective. But it's actually the most biased perspective because you're limited to one point of view. Bias 24. The naive realism bias. You believe that you see the world objectively, that your perceptions are accurate representations of reality, and that anyone who disagrees with you is either ignorant, irrational, or biased. A person holds a political belief. They think this belief is objectively true. They've looked at facts. They've thought critically. Their conclusion is accurate, but people who disagree, those people must be irrational or biased. They're not seeing the facts clearly. They're distorting reality because of their bias. But here's the problem. The other people believe exactly the same thing about themselves. They believe they see the world objectively. They believe they've looked at facts and thought critically. Their conclusion is accurate, and you must be irrational or biased because you disagree. This bias keeps people from understanding that different people genuinely see the world differently, not because one group is rational and the other is irrational, but because each person is interpreting ambiguous information through their own frameworks, values, and experiences. In science, naive realism creates problems. Scientists from different paradigms genuinely see different things when they look at the same data. A scientist working in one paradigm sees evidence that confirms their paradigm. A scientist in a different paradigm sees the same evidence as ambiguous or irrelevant. Neither scientist is irrational. They're just interpreting the same data differently. In relationships, naive realism creates conflict. You believe your perspective on an argument is objective. Your partner believes their perspective is objective. Neither of you can see that you're both interpreting the situation through your own lenses. The mechanism driving this is perspectival realism and bias externalization. Your perspective feels like the most complete and accurate perspective because it's the one you have access to. Other perspectives feel partial and biased because you're viewing them from outside. So you externalize bias. You see bias in other people's perspectives, but not in your own. Why does your brain do this? Because seeing yourself as objective and accurate is comforting. If everyone who disagrees with you is simply irrational or biased, then you don't have to worry about being wrong. You're just seeing reality clearly. Bias 25. The reactive devaluation bias. When someone else values something, you devalue it. If something becomes desirable to a competitor or an enemy, you assume it's less valuable. If something is only important to people you disagree with, you assume it's less important. A person is indifferent about a political policy. But then they realize the opposing political party strongly supports this policy. Suddenly, the policy seems worse to them. They find reasons not to support it, even though their initial evaluation was neutral. In business negotiations, reactive devaluation creates problems. A company is willing to make a concession. But if the other company really wants the concession, the first company assumes the concession must be more valuable than they realized, so they become less willing to make it. The other company's desire for the concession makes the concession seem more valuable, which makes the first company less willing to give it up. Here's a relationship example. A person is indifferent about something, but then their partner also cares about it. Now the person devalues it. Or conversely, a person loves something, but then their partner also loves it. Suddenly, the person finds flaws with it. They want their identity to be distinct. In psychology research, reactive devaluation affects how people evaluate mental health treatments. If a treatment is recommended by the other side in a cultural debate, people devalue it. If anti-vaccine activists say that a particular vaccine is bad, some people will devalue that vaccine, even if they were previously supportive. The mechanism driving this is distinctiveness motivation and competitive framing. Your brain wants you to be distinct and valued. If something becomes valuable to someone else, your brain interprets this as potential competition for resources or status. So your brain devalues it to preserve your own status or uniqueness. Additionally, your brain frames other people's preferences as competitive threats, not as information about actual value. Why does your brain do this? Because being distinct is important for status and identity. If everyone values the same things, you're not unique. So your brain creates distinction by devaluing what others value. This bias is partly about preserving your own identity as separate and valued. Conclusion. The architecture beneath consciousness. These 25 cognitive biases are not separate, isolated phenomena. They're not quirks of human psychology that occur randomly. They're the architecture of human thinking itself. They form a unified system, and understanding one bias helps you understand others. They interact. They reinforce each other. They create the structure of consciousness. When you combine confirmation bias with the backfire effect, you get belief systems that are extremely resistant to change. When you combine the fundamental attribution error with naive realism, you get complete inability to understand another person's perspective. When you combine the planning fallacy with the illusion of control, you get unrealistic confidence in your own abilities. These biases are not glitches. They're not errors in the human operating system. They're features that were installed because they increase survival. In a world of ambiguity and incomplete information, these biases help you make decisions quickly. They help you function despite uncertainty. They help you maintain coherence and meaning. But in the modern world, these biases cost you. They keep you from learning. They keep you from understanding other people. They keep you from seeing the world clearly. They keep you locked in conflict with people who see the world differently. They keep you making the same mistakes repeatedly. The profound truth is that you cannot escape these biases. You cannot think your way out of them. They're not in your conscious mind where logical argumentation can reach them. They're in your neurons, in your perceptual systems, in the very architecture of how your brain processes information. But you can become aware of them. You can notice when these biases are influencing your thinking. You can pause. You can create space between the automatic impulse and your action. You can ask yourself whether you're falling into a pattern. You can consider alternative perspectives. You can seek information from people who think differently than you do. The people who understand themselves best are not people who have eliminated these biases. They're people who have learned to recognize their biases, to notice when they're active, to compensate for them. They're people who've become students of their own minds. They've learned to observe the patterns beneath their consciousness. They've learned that the mind that thinks it sees clearly is the mind most likely to be deceived. As you close your eyes tonight, think about the biases that shaped your day. Think about the decisions you made that were influenced by cognitive patterns you never consciously registered. Think about the people you judged based on incomplete information. Think about the beliefs you held with unwarranted certainty. Think about the times you were absolutely sure you were right when you were actually filtered through a bias you didn't even know you had. And realize that this is not a cause for despair. This is a cause for wonder. Your mind is magnificently complex. It processes information in ways you'll never fully understand. It keeps you alive. It allows you to function in a world of impossible complexity. Yes, it deceives you. Yes, it filters reality. Yes, it creates illusions. But it does all of this as a feature, not a bug. Your mind is trying to keep you alive and functional, even if the cost is that you don't see reality exactly as it is. So tomorrow, as you wake and go about your day, carry with you the awareness that you're always seeing the world through a lens. That lens is not reality. It's an interpretation, and recognizing that lens, noticing it, understanding it, becoming aware of its limitations is the first step toward genuine wisdom. Not the wisdom of someone who sees things clearly, but the wisdom of someone who knows they can't, who accepts that limitation, and who remains open to being wrong. The biases you've explored tonight will continue operating tomorrow. They'll influence your decisions, your relationships, your perception of reality. You can't stop them, but you can join them. You can make peace with your programmed mind. You can become friends with the biases that are part of your nature. And in that friendship, in that acceptance, you might find a way to transcend them, not by eliminating them, but by understanding them so deeply that they begin to lose their power over you. This is the silent law of the human mind. We are all prisoners of our own neurology, and the greatest freedom comes not from escaping that prison, but from understanding it so completely that the prison walls become transparent. You can see through them then. You can see other people. You can see the world. You can see yourself. And in that clarity, not a clarity that frees you from bias, but a clarity that acknowledges bias, you find wisdom.